Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Future-Proofing Your Agency Through Performance Management. My name is Neelo Parvinashtiani and I will help facilitate today's webinar. So today's webinar is hosted by the National Operations Center of Excellence, or NOCO. If you don't know us already, at NOCO we offer resources to support the transportation systems management and operations or TSMA community. If you were curious to learn more about us, on the bottom left side of the screen, I've shared with you the links to NOCO Knowledge Center and also our other points of contact. Now let me cover a few logistics. So this webinar is being recorded and the presentations and the recording will be posted on NOCO's on-demand learning section of NOCO's website. All the attendees' phones are on listen-only mode by default, but I would like you to stay engaged by using the question discussion pod that you see here at the screen to put in any questions or comments. As those questions come to your mind during each presentation, please feel free to put that in the chat pod. At the end of the webinar, I will read those questions out loud and will direct it to our presenters to answer each of those questions. For the webinar today, a special thanks goes to Peter Rafferty and Matt Schimmer from Gannett Fleming, who helped us with planning for this webinar. The last thing I'll cover would be the agenda and the presenters. To keep this part brief, I wouldn't be reading the presenters' full bios, but that is available on the webinars page, so please refer to those to learn more about our speakers today. The first presentations of today's webinar will be from Peter Rafferty from Gannett Fleming, who will cover an overview of the agency future-proofing through performance management. That will be followed with a presentation from David Putz from Iowa DOT, who will discuss the organizational aspect of the agency future-proofing. And then last but not least, we'll have Peter Smith with Texas DOT, who will cover Texas DOT's performance-based planning and programming process. After those three presentations, we'll have the Q&A session where we'll have all the panelists to help answer your questions. So that is all I had. And with that, I would like to hand it over to our first presenter, Peter, to start us off with the webinar.
Thank you, Neelo. Hello and welcome, everybody. And Neelo, tell me if the audio isn't good. To clarify for everybody off the bat, today we're talking about the business of performance management. So we'll ignore the rabbit holes for measures or KPIs, metrics calculations, or dashboards, and certainly not target setting or the fantastic expense given to that. What we are emphasizing today are best practices applied to transportation agencies. So you'll hear things about organizational alignment, the cascade from vision to specific outcomes, the cross-functional decision-making, and things like that. And we assert that doing these things well inherently future-proof transportation agencies. Motivation for thinking harder about performance management comes from three trends that we're really seeing. First, increasingly scarce resources. More constraints obviously aren't a good thing, coupled with greater competition and transparency, which are good things. Second is a wild proliferation of data and software, in a sense making it too easy to count the wrong stuff or make snappy widgets that are, in the end, often counterproductive. It's way too easy to lose track of the great measures, and I'll come back to some of that. Third is transportation technology. So here's a good problem to have. Transportation agencies struggling to adapt to so many disruptive technologies or new operational strategies. The sharing economy, big data, whatever that is, Internet of Things, smart infrastructure, connected applications, AI, faster and faster wireless networks, cybersecurity headaches, automated vehicles that can keep their distracted, asleep, or passed out drunk drivers underway. You can see Palo Alto in November last year. And let me find my button here. Including some partially automated vehicles with a propensity to crash into trucks and fixed objects, sometimes killing their occupants. Of course, I'm not naming any specific companies here. Some call this the fourth industrial revolution. Whatever you call it, agencies are charged with delivering safe and efficient mobility in a real fundamental sense. And new ideas should help that. But this disruption that we're faced with makes these institutional changes really not easy. So performance management, done well, can help as a solid business foundation, agnostic, and that's a key word, agnostic toward uncertain future technology. But done badly, we are faced with distraction or wasted resources, unintended consequences, distraction, gaming, and with ever more data, and I don't like that cliche, big data. We have these ever-expanding data swamps. You may have heard the term data lakes, which are more organized. So it's very easy for folks to wade into their swamps and pull out measures for all manner of things. Activities or milestones, outputs, calls to 511, tons of salt, number of roadkill removed, dollars spent on new pavement, and so on. A million things that are not outcomes nor key performance indicators. Then all these get reported ad nauseum in annual reports and uncluttered dashboards and clever widgets, and we're really in a quagmire here. Folks often, well, some folks will pride themselves on making up measures. I saw a bar chart recently that had a performance measure for number of measures. I'm not kidding. You also may have heard another cliche, that which gets measured gets managed, or something like that. But too often, that which gets measured is what is most easily measured. And that's a quote from Jerry Muller in his recent book, The Tyranny of Metrics. And I say, stop it. We're losing sight of measuring the right outcomes. Peter S., coming up, may mention how Texas DOT has done a great job just recently cutting the number of their performance indicators in half already. I also recommend another book, Big Data, Big Dupe by Stephen Few, if you're looking for other resources on this. Briefly, as an aside on our dashboarding mess, since we're not otherwise talking about dashboards today, and I do make a distinction between performance dashboards versus situational awareness dashboards or diagnostic tools. The point is, just as making up useless measures is easy, making sexy dashboards is easy with all these tools we have. You know, what's the harm, you might ask? Well, it makes a lousy measure look more important than it actually is, and it can dilute or distract from more important outcomes. Ask yourself, if you're measuring something and including it on a dashboard, what are you going to do with that information? If you don't have an answer, get rid of it. There are more important things to focus on. Also, please, I've got a chip on my shoulder about these dials and gauges that show up. Forgive me if you're a fan, but performance is not about snapshots. It's about improvement through time, and the way to show that is with a trend over time. So I do encourage that. Among other really good guiding principles that we have for effective dashboards, these are critical tools for communicating performance, and we can do better there. Pressing on, let's turn to a couple of examples from other related industries. First, consider the many thousands of things that an airline has to keep track of for their operations: schedules, maintenance, safety, personnel, suppliers, costs, getting pretzels on board. Credit to David Parmenter, another author, for writing about British Airways. That company transformed itself several years ago under a guy named John King by ruthlessly prioritizing one outcome. Their 1,000 other measures remained important for managing operations, but prioritizing on-time departures, focused resources, and accountability where needed for performance improvement, and it worked. If something went wrong with on-time departures, John King would hear about it. Yeah, he would go and make sure he's holding business units accountable, but he wouldn't micromanage. He empowered those business units to be innovative in how to improve. So by measuring the right outcome, they're able to be technology agnostic and thus future-proofing and allowing these innovations to happen. You'll hear a little more about this innovation dynamic from Dave coming up next. Another example from industry comes from FedEx. This is one others may have heard of. It was referenced in a Federal Highway Administration report several years ago, but in their case, they emphasize also one outcome, on-time package delivery. It's still supported by 12 other indices, but like British Airways, there are thousands of other things that they have to still attend to, but the emphasis on the key outcome, focused priorities, and aligned that organization from top to bottom. So things aren't all in disarray in our own industry. There was an international scan we did several years ago for a client in the Middle East, and Transport for London really came up as a best practice. And what they were doing is they were focusing mainly on one KPI, key performance indicator. And we use KPI and measure interchangeably, or at least indicator and measure interchangeably. The one they focused on is travel time reliability in the morning peak period. That's it. And they focused hard on that, and they have daily accountability, and they tried different things in their corridor teams, not down to individuals, shaming people, there's none of that, but within corridor teams, they were encouraged to experiment and try new things. You're going to hear some great stuff from Iowa and Texas next, especially with their Texas's performance-based decision-making. Another example that comes to my mind whenever I talk about this is a district in Michigan, with the Michigan DOT, that had great success in adopting Cubby's 4 disciplines of execution, the Stephen Covey legacy. There's establishing clear accountability, that's 1. Using awesome dashboards, that's 2. Showing things through time with no gauges. Number 3 was emphasizing the lead measures. And if you want to know about that distinction between lead and lag measures, we can follow up, but it's related to the top of cliff, bottom of cliff metaphor. A specific example of that in incident management area is they may have a desired outcome that secondary crashes are minimized for incident management programs. So their lag measure after the fact is going to be the count of secondary crashes. But the lead measure gets at an actual directly influenceable activity that they can do as an agency. The lead measure that goes with that, in my opinion, the best one is roadway clearance time. By reducing that exposure and tracking and working on that lead measure of roadway clearance time, you're making a bet that that lag measure of secondary crashes is going to improve. So anyway, that's the 3rd one, emphasizing the lead measures. And the 4th one is focusing on a wildly important goal, or WIG. This is Cubby the Cat, and this will help you remember Cubby's WIG. So I show it here for you. That district focusing on, in Michigan, was focused on the excellent lag measure of user delay cost and continually tracked it over time, no gauges. The measure works really well because it encompasses so many things, recurring delay plus impacts from work zones, weather effects, crashes, freight bottlenecks, all kinds of things with a whole variety of different efforts that can be applied to improving those. That's the one they were focusing on for their goal, is reducing that user delay cost. And by tracking it over time, again, not a gauge, they know if it's getting better or worse. And if it's getting worse, they find out why. And they put that accountability on teams, again, not individuals. And improving that measure relies on empowering those teams to try new things to improve their own lead measures. such as incident clearance or winter road regain time is a measure that they use, things related to work zone alerts, and so on. So that's Cubby's WIG. But not to be left out due to a pesky trademark, there are always other frameworks such as the big, hairy, audacious goal. That's BAG with an H, and I'm not kidding. You can look it up. If you don't recognize this orange thing, it's Gritty, the Philadelphia Flyers' new mascot that terrorizes their rivals. Regardless, take your pick of your framework. The key takeaway is being explicit about your most important goal. I bet it's something more to do with safety or mobility than it is with the number of Twitter followers. Here's my one wordy slide, but I do want to impress upon you the importance of explicit linkages from vision, from an agency's vision and mission and goals and getting those goals right, all the way through objectives, processes, and then to results. And here another synonymous term is results and outcomes, the way I talk about it. And by getting those results and outcomes really pinpointed well, your measures are going to make the most sense. And the measure we want is the most relevant and feasible quantification of evidence for an outcome that's strongly linked to a goal. That's the definition of the measure that I encourage you to think about when you're looking at your whole universe or collection of measures. Now note, there's nothing in here about a specific tactic or technology. I want functional units to be empowered to work on improvements. Again, I think Dave is going to talk a little bit more about that dynamic. So this is the business of performance management we're talking about. And when done well, it is inherently future-proof. You be intentional by pinpointing that desired outcome, such as increased freight reliability or decreasing bicycle pedestrian incidents. There are all kinds of great examples out there. And then your excellent measures defined. You track it over time. Did I mention no gauges? And then us transportation professionals are free to adapt and experiment with any part of this fourth industrial revolution. How you do it is up to you. The mobility and technology universe is going to continually change on us, but the agency goals and desired outcomes don't have to be overrun by all of this distraction and the disruption that this technology is causing us. We can hardly imagine what this future is going to look like, but by measuring the right things, at least we will know if we're improving on our outcomes or not, and then we can act on it. That's what I had to share by way of setup, and I think at this point, I'll turn it back over to Nilu or Dave. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Peter. Next, I'm going to bring up David's presentation and turn the floor to him.
Well, hello. I first want to say thank you. I appreciate having the opportunity to participate in the NOCO webinar today. I'll be sharing some insights from the work we've been doing in the Iowa DOT. We've been focusing on organizational performance management for a while. That's in addition to transportation performance management. Hopefully as we go through the presentation, you'll see the differentiation. So, title, Future-Proofing Your Agency Through Performance Management. This is actually the first presentation I've asked future-proofing on, but it ties really nicely into the work that we're doing as an agency. So I started with something simplistic, and that's trying to find a definition, right? So I identified this as the process of anticipating the future and developing methods for minimizing the effects and shocks and stresses, basically preparing an organization, right, for the unknown. Seems like a pretty straightforward and very positive, upbeat goal, right? Here's the problem. Who has the crystal ball? There's no way in the world, given all the variables in the world, especially the ones Peter identified, that we're going to be able to accurately predict exactly what, when, and how things are going to happen. So I think actually the reasonable question we should ask is, how do we prepare to actually deal with whatever it is that comes our way. Traditionally, this is probably through planning, or going through and analyzing, say, after action reports and diagnosing reaction to plans. What I'd like to offer, there are two things we can really focus on, and that would be our people and the organizations. So ultimately, what we really want is to have people in organizations with the skill sets and unencumbered in a way that they can actually respond in an effective manner. I mean, that would be a great goal. So how do we get organizations to be, whether you call it responsive or agile, or in this particular presentation we're using future-proofing, how do we get them to be that nimble? And I think there's a really important observation to be made here, that organizations don't change. It's the people within them that do. And it's the action of the people, both in terms of the work they do and the way they organize the structure of an organization, that actually is the key aspect of this. And when you start on it, I think a logical place to start is actually the workforce. And I'd like to present 4 notions that, or 4 concepts that we can use to help build that kind of flexibility and skill set in our workforce to handle the unknown. I'd like to present what for the presentation, I'm going to be calling the 4 A's. The first of that is awareness. So the big question here is, do your employees have situational awareness about the work they do, where they fit in the organization, how what they do contributes and relates? I've sometimes used the phrase making an employee the king of their work. King in chess moves one position in all directions. Does each employee in the organization know their role well enough that they can basically step into one position away from themselves and know it well enough that actually they could contribute if there would be a gap? That kind of level of knowledge is really important. And this awareness is actually something that's coming across in multiple areas now. If you're reading any research or literature on workforce development and employee engagement, you may have read Patrick Lencioni. He's changed the title of the book, but it started off 3 Signs of a Miserable Job. He talks about relevance. If you read Daniel Pink's book on Drive, he will talk about purpose. And sociologists are not too far behind. One recently had a special on Netflix. Brene Brown talks about clarity. If you studied engagement at all, the very first question in Gallup's Q12 is, I know what's expected of me. So this notion of awareness is really critical when it comes to employees in the workforce in general. The second of the A's I'd identify would be ability. And that is, can they actually do the things you just outlined for them? Being aware of them is part of the battle, but if they're not actually in the position and have the skills to do the things you've asked them to do, all you're going to do is raise a level of frustration. And we're talking not just, skills and tools, but do they have the information they need and the skill set that they can actually leverage the data that Pete references in that swamp? Can they get the right data, do the right work? Can they turn it into monitoring and measuring in a way that's actually productive? And probably lastly, this notion of barriers in organizations. There's also nothing more frustrated than having a situationally aware employee with a great skill set who has to overcome barriers within the organization. Practices, procedures. I mean, we're certainly very regulated in government, and that's probably true in other areas as well. So the notion of ability I would offer as a second key component when it comes to building flexibility and responsiveness in a workforce. I'd also add to this the notion of authority. Even with the first 2 in place, if they don't actually have the responsibility / authority, that is, they can actually make a change with the goal of improving and I know improvement just not changing, but changing with purpose. If they don't have the authority to make those changes, you're also going to spike the frustration level. This concept of purpose, though, is really twofold. Locally, it might be their client need or customer need. On a more global scale, it's purpose or alignment. Does the organization have that? Does it communicate it well? In addition, if you really want to empower or give this sense of authority, is it beyond just changing where a report goes or changing a format on a report? Can they work with suppliers and customers and broaden that area of influence so they can actually have an impact on both the responsiveness and the quality of the work they do? The last of the A's, I guess, I'd offer for the workforce is accountability. And this is really not old school. You missed a target, I'm going to slap you with some sort of problem or issue or injunction or fire you even, right? It's really more about following through. Are they really focused on process? Do they get it? Are they using good, valid information? Are they focused on the customer? Not so much that they're within a certain percent of a target. And ultimately, is the mindset that their goal always is to improve, and are they using the tools and information they have available to them to make a difference? And I'd offer that if you had a workforce that had all four of those, the last one really almost being a mindset, right, a culture of improvement and learning and adjusting, then I think your workforce would be in a really, really good position to be able to adapt to whatever comes at it. So those folks sit in an organization with some sort of structure. So let's turn attention here just for a little bit on the organizational side. And I'd offer the following, that if we're talking about future-proofing, that is being able to respond and handle the unknown, a critical aspect here is the degree to which the physical structure is built and arranged to either support or hinder the work that you're asking them to do. I'll give you an example in the area of technology. DOTs across the country are wanting to improve their ability to leverage the data they have. They'd love to be able to hire, say, data scientists and do more advanced analytics. But the classification structures they have are antiquated, and the idea of a data scientist didn't even exist. So they're struggling because their structures don't actually allow the alignment of potential positions to the actual need that's in place. That would be a structural barrier in my mind. Others would be decision-making, layers of bureaucracy, and so forth. So organizations, I think, are really a critical component of this, because while the workforce might be working on improving relationships and products for customers, leaders really need to be focused on how the organization itself is structured and how it functions to actually facilitate improvement. In line with these conversations, the DOT, we've been talking about performance management for a while, and I think this may resonate with many of you. Very often there's a lot of conversation about, I have too much work to do, I don't have enough resources, so what do I prioritize? How do I actually organize and prioritize my work? And not being able to do so creates a problem, because if you try to do it all, you're thin and things don't progress. If you narrow it as the wrong thing, right, certainly there's a consequence to that. So in our work, we're trying to pass on the thinking of vertically aligning an organization. That is, wherever you are in the organization, you're doing work for a customer, product or service or some activity, and it's for a desired outcome. But how do we work to make sure that all those moving pieces and all the outcomes they're shooting for are actually mutually supportive of one another? So wherever you're at the organization, can you look up and see how you're contributing to the larger department outcome? Peter mentioned safe mobility. That happens to be a lot of our focus here at the Iowa DOT currently. But the notion of setting them at the top and then kind of aligning them down, chances are you've heard it referred to as cascading. Simplistically, it's are we doing the right things or not, right? And I really see that as being probably the primary purview of leadership, not so much as frontline managers. So if your resources are tight and you need to make the resourcing decisions, the ability to figure out what the right thing is critically important. Now, there is a key question here, and that's why focus on outcomes. And like Peter said, we don't want to get into a lot of measurement terminology here, but an outcome is really the end result or the desired result of the work you're doing. And you can align to measures and structures or outcomes. We opted not to focus on metrics because they change. We often pick the low-hanging fruit and realize it's the wrong thing, and then we again, and then we pick it for easy data or easy to understand or the squeaky wheel or what have you. Measures very often change very frequently. Very difficult to align to something that's constantly in motion. And the notion of aligning to the structure of an organization, I think just perpetuates the structure. And if the goal is that your form will follow your function, I don't think you want to flip that. It will create institutional barriers and hinder flexibility. So we've opted to focus on the outcome as a primary area of focus. It's also supportive of the notion of not wanting to micromanage the workforce. We can communicate the what and the why through outcomes without actually coming down and dictating the how. I think we cross the line sometimes when we start telling people how they do their work, when and with what materials and all that. Pretty much guts the professionalism of an organization. Really can have a negative impact on morale. So at least for us, we've been intentionally discussing the notion of a focus on outcomes with the hope of still maintaining the creativity and innovation we would need in order to be able to be responsive. So we talked about vertical alignment a lot and the focus on outcomes. There's one added benefit to that, and that's that we can take all the work of process improvement, whether it's lean, CQI, TQM, and hook it into a model, into a framework of outcomes. Can't remember the person who first identified this, but the notion of improving your processes is really about getting things done the right way. And the notion of the organizational outcomes lined up is really about doing the right things. Now, internally, we've called those horizontal alignment. That's the process improvement stuff, and vertical alignment. And the connection point for us is really the outcome. So the goal here is that the workforce, trained in process knowledge, measurement, monitoring, if they have the 4 A's, they build the muscle memory to be able to adapt and react to any outcome that's set in front of them. Okay, so that's really important. The workforce can react to and hit outcomes, not targets, the outcomes we set for them, whatever they happen to be. Well, now if I turn that around and I can build the same capacity in leadership, that is to set outcomes and clearly communicate them, then I have, I think, actually committed to the creation of an organization that has muscle memory at 2 completely different levels that work together. One, the ability to adapt and align to the important things that have to get it done, as well as focusing a workforce on accomplishing whatever those outcomes are. And I think that's a really key blending of the 2 pieces, the horizontal alignment component. So I'm going to go back to the first question, right? What do we do to prepare? No crystal ball. Can't know the future, but we can be ready, or at least better prepared for it. So I think I'd offer that a workforce that's actually armed with the 4 A's, the awareness, ability, authority, and accountability, they learn they grow in their skill set, they become more aware, and they actually can have being responsive as a normal way of doing business if we give them that opportunity. I'd leave it to leadership, not necessarily management, but top leadership, at least a leadership mindset. Maybe that's a better way of putting that. To identify really what the key outcomes are for an organization and learn to communicate and cascade those down. If we can do those two and put them together in a way that they're mutually supportive, I think we end up with a really a much greater chance to respond to the unforeseen. A recent piece by Kinsey wrote that Agile organizations are both stable and dynamic. They're made up of teams of people with a culture that features rapid learning and fast decision-making cycles. So we need the alignment, but at the same time, we need teams of people who actually can understand and make changes and improvements. So I'd offer that probably from an organizational performance management point of view, make sure they're working on the right things and then support them so they can get things done the right way. If we can do that successfully, then I think we have a chance of becoming much more responsive, and I can't say future-proof, but maybe I can say future-prepared. And with that, I'll close. Peter, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good. Sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. Just a reminder for everyone to put in your questions as they come up. And that's all I wanted to cover. Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, good afternoon. I have to say, both David and Peter, you have awesome broadcasting voices. I wish I was good at that. I'm going to start by saying deliver the right projects on time and on budget. Relating back to Peter R's conversation, that's one of our widely important goals in the Department of Transportation. You will hear common themes with what I'm about to discuss and what Peter R. and David discussed just now. But I'm also going to take a bit of a different tack by focusing on how we're using and planning on using performance to help inform investment decisions through the various stages of our planning and programming cycle at TxDOT, all to help deliver the right projects on time and on budget. I'll walk briefly through the stages of our planning and programming cycle, highlighting some approaches and tools that we've been developing and implementing. Many participants, I think, will be aware of federal requirements for setting performance targets. Additionally, in Texas, there are requirements for TxDOT and its planning partners, such as the MPOs, to develop and implement performance-based planning and programming measures. They're kind of both relating to Peter and David's discussions. There's more of a motivation than just complying with requirements. It is about, at the end of the day, being able to focus limited resources to be able to be most effective in meeting our WIGs, our widely important goals. So this graphic, I'll just take a brief moment. It's a simplified representation of TxDOT's planning and programming processes. When I presented, just as an aside, when I presented our full version to the commission, it was too unpalatable because too much information, so we simplified it. But we have a vision for embracing performance considerations throughout the planning and programming cycles. So that's basically using performance-based approaches to help identify and prioritize long-range system-wide need, prioritize need within a given corridor, help decisions for distributing projected funding to programs and portfolios, as well as to prioritize individual projects for funding. So I'm going to touch on a few of these, hopefully not take up too long, but showing you some of the processes and tools that we've developed to help us with that. At TxDOT, we divide our project development into authority phases. That basically is giving authorization to invest in the development of projects from long-range planning through project preliminary development, through detailed design, and then letting for construction. This graphic at the bottom row there identifies some of the tools and approaches that we've been developing to help inform decisions on how we invest in the development of our programs and projects. So I'll quickly flip through the next slide to show some of those approaches and tools. We at TechStop, it's not bragging, but we spend millions of dollars per year just even performing corridor studies, let alone the billions of dollars to go into construction. So those studies may vary in geographic and technical scope. In the past, maybe this is the same with a lot of agencies, there may have been no systematic way of deciding when to do what. And oftentimes it might be a combination of political pressures and loudest voices that have been the most typical impetuses behind initiating a study. For example, we get legislators to do studies. We visualize an approach to look at the whole state system and then assess the system based on need. We engaged a consultant, AECOM, through one of our on-call contracts to help develop a tool to automate the process. The work to date has resulted in what you see in front of you called the corridor prioritization tool. I'm only going to give you what I call a wave my hands view, but the approach focuses on scoring need by looking at existing conditions and assessing 6 key areas associated with system preservation, safety, mobility, and economic development. I only know I mentioned 4 there, but it includes 6 areas. So we use GIS coverages, or some of you refer them to as layers, as well as a lot of detailed attributes that are associated with each of the performance areas to establish a score for all of the corridors in our network. Our current prototype covers interstate highways and most U.S. highways. We're now working to complete, we've got the coverage data, the geographic coverage data for all of the rest of the system, but putting the right attribute data for the whole system is what we're currently working on to complete the whole network. A user can apply and adjust weights in the key performance areas. Those key ones are pavement, bridge, safety, congestion, economic development, and connectivity. But at the moment, drilling down to the next level, the weights on individual performance measures are fixed. So one key result is that we can look at the whole system of whole statewide system and score and rank those corridors by need. And just to repeat kind of what I was alluding to earlier on, is the intent here is to help guide decisions on which corridor studies we then invest in. What are the priorities for investing in the next level of corridor studies? We can drill down further in terms of not just looking at the overall performance areas, but we can rank by any of the key performance areas that I mentioned before. And next steps then are for us to complete the attribute data for the remaining parts of the network, as well as validate and refine the scoring system, and potentially work with our IT department. I'm sure a lot of agencies, they have a very formal way of actually having to get software either purchased or developed. So we're calling this proof of concept right now until we can go through the right process to actually have it developed into a fully implementable software package. Similar to the corridor prioritization tool, which like I said was statewide, network-wide, we've also been developing a tool, also with AECOM, that we're calling the corridor evaluation tool, in which we break down the corridors into segments, typically of as close as we can, roughly independent utility, ultimately to help inform decisions on which segments to prioritize for further detailed project development, the investment that it takes to do that, and then subsequently consideration for funding in what we call our Unified Transportation Program, a 10-year fiscally constrained program. This is for reference only. I'm not going to go through it in detail. You'll be happy to know, but it does identify the performance areas that we look at for the corridor evaluation tool, along with the measures and data sources that we use. Similar to the corridor prioritization tool, we can look at how each segment scores with respect to each of the key performance areas that we're using. Both of those tools, the CPT and CET, assess need in the advanced planning stages of project development. We as TxDOT have to develop a fiscally constrained 10-year program. I mentioned that was called the Unified Transportation Program. UTP, if I refer to that, that's what we're talking about. That's a program of projects that are targeted for detailed development with the objective of going to construction within that 10-year window. We develop a planning forecast, which is an optimistic estimate of revenue over a 10-year period. We are then required to recommend to our commission, the TxDOT Commission, how to distribute those projected revenues to our 12 funding categories. So this graphic just highlights the iterative scenario-based approach that we're using now to help establish a recommendation for investment into those funding categories. I'll key into a few areas of that. Kind of going back to Peter's comment about not having too many measures because you try to get out of the data swamp. We do focus on 6 key performance measures that I've listed out here. I won't go through them individually. I will just say, though, that part of the improvement process is looking at how these work for us and trying to determine if they're the best measures that we can use to help make investment decisions. And then I think, Peter, you also mentioned at one point we, as a state, had over 200 performance measures. We've whittled those down to 100 performance measures, although for the discussion focused on performance measures for investment planning, we cut those down way further still. So we'll take a number of different distribution scenarios and we make sure that each of those scenarios conform to the multitude of criteria and constraints that we might have, but that are associated with different strategies. So here, for example, we might have a strategy that focuses on congestion versus the other end of the extreme, which is typically a strategy that focuses on safety and system preservation. In this case, there's 3 strategies there, one that's in between that we're calling a balanced strategy, just as an example, somewhere in between. Because what we do find is you could throw all of your money at congestion, maintenance and safety could go to pot, and you still haven't solved the congestion problem. But at the same time, there's a lot of pressure to be able to put some investment into congestion relief. So for each trial distribution, and this is just a sample here, we use historical portfolio data to estimate a matrix of how much each strategy contributes to each performance area. So we call that middle table there, or that going from that left-hand table to the middle table, we call that the investment crosswalk, so that we try to estimate how much value any of the strategies have in terms of contributing towards each of these performance areas. And then we go to each of our subject matter experts and owners of the different performance areas with those different investment strategies and ask them to make a projection of the performance outcomes for the measures that they're responsible. And then we can kind of compare those to established targets. So that those, to match up with our Unified Transportation Program, those are 10-year projections. So these, this is just a sample of estimated performance outcomes for our 2019 UTP, which was adopted last year, and compared with the targets that had been set for last year. Our metropolitan planning organizations and our geographic TxDOT districts are required by that House Bill 20 that I showed you on the slide earlier on, actually to rank their portfolios, score and rank their portfolios of projects. But whenever projects involve leveraging statewide funding, then we score and prioritize projects for funding for recommendation to our commission. So we've been working with our consultant, Alliance Transportation Group, to we have multiple data sources, and so we developed a data pre-processing tool that accesses those multiple databases and prepares it for input to some proprietary software called Decision Lens. We've been working with Decision Lens, and they've been very flexible in working with us to tailor their software to allow us to score and rank projects in any portfolio based on a prediction of each project's ability to perform in each of our 6 key performance areas. In addition to these scores, we do, it can't all just get down to numbers, so we do take into consideration a lot of other logistical and strategic factors to actually develop our recommendations. And then in addition to performance measure outcomes that oftentimes the public and others may not understand, we do try to translate those into more tangible numbers and outcomes, such as how many miles of new capacity we might anticipate based on the approved funding distribution. And kind of going back to Peter R's stages for performance, then a key element of it is being able to monitor and track. So like I was saying before, across the department we have about 100-odd measures. Some of those are lead indicators. Many of those are lead indicators because, again, going back to Peter's discussion, you need some warning before you fall off the cliff. So we have a number of deliberate lead indicators that we identify, as well as lag indicators to then say, well, how did we do? But all together collectively to try and help make sure that we are on track, but also help inform decisions for future changes that we might need to make, both in terms of are we using the right measures or do we have the right information, and then going back to David's conversation then about making sure that we're continually improving the things that we're doing. So I've listed here some key works in progress, but we have implemented measures to conform with both those federal and state requirements. We're working on many enhancements as we work towards our vision of full cycle performance-based planning and programming. Also listed some key challenges out here, but I'll just kind of mention that the biggest challenge I find is getting people to have the patience for us to be able to develop a long enough history of data and seeing what the outcomes of our decisions have been made. Do they line up with where we thought they would be? So we've got to have some time of doing this ultimately to help give us a higher level of confidence in our ability to predict the outcomes and help make better investment decisions going forward. So in summary, we've been implementing and will continue to improve upon how we use performance-based planning and programming measures to help inform decisions on how we make investments at various programming and project planning stages. Also how we predict outcomes and how we use those for target setting. I know, Peter, in a previous conversation, you were talking about not setting targets before you've got appropriate measures, and I know there's a tendency for agencies to set targets, and that happened with us among others, but then we're establishing these procedures then to hopefully be able to inform future decisions on how to set those targets, among other things. So that's all I have for now. I'll hand control back over.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Peter. At this time, we have some time left for the webinar for attendees to type in any questions that they may have. I don't see any questions yet, but let's see. Okay, I see the first question. I'm going to read that out, but please put in any thoughts, any questions that you may have while we're doing this first question. So this is a question for Peter Smith about economic development. Peter, in your discussion of Texas DOT's goals as well as the 6 inputs into the corridor prioritization tool, you included economic development. What are your measures for that? That seems to be a tricky one to pin down for transportation agencies.
It is very tricky, and I might say, first of all, we kind of go to different levels at the different stages through the planning cycle, and it is probably, I would say, our weakest area in terms of the level of development. For our needs-based approach, for both the system-wide level and the corridor level, we look at existing population density, we look at existing employment density, we look at projected traffic growth rates, percentage of private land, truck volume, commodity flow. Those are some key ones, and I mean there's some commonality all the way through the process that actually is a little bit more refined at the earlier stages with the CPT and the CET, and then individual project level we're a lot we more focus on freight traffic and the projection of how an individual project will improve freight flow. So that's kind of the primary relationship that we use as a gauge for economic development.
Thanks. I'm gonna give it a minute. I don't see any questions yet, but I'm just gonna give it a minute. In the meantime, Peter and David, if you had any additional thoughts or anything that you wanted to mention, happy to give you the floor for that.
Well, I actually have a question back to Peter that he can maybe expound on, and I was alluding to it before, maybe give us some more perspective on, performance measures versus targets, and then even goals versus targets, because a lot of people talk about goals and get goals and targets mixed up. So maybe you might like to expound on those.
Yeah, sure. I can a little bit. So I would refer people to that the slide toward the end that had that process, or the connection from vision and mission. And I put goals much more toward the left, and I thinking of that in a strategic planning context where you start with your goals and you really try to pin those down. You focus on those. You could use that SMART acronym for something like that. The specific, measurable, actionable, relevant, time-bound thing. And I put goals there. That's what I mean by goals at that end of the spectrum. And then as you move down and you get into your outcomes or results, and Dave had a great definition of what the result and outcome. I don't recall it verbatim here, but that's what you are ultimately after at the functional area level. Only then do you come and then attach a measure to it. If you've gotten that far, getting the right measure attached to it is going to be straightforward. Actually getting the data for that may be trickier, and that'll take some work to implement that. but you know that you're on the right track with something that's very tightly connected up through that cascade through your organization. Now, when I say, and people hear me say all the time, targets should be optional. They should just be optional. If you are tracking things over time and looking at the trends, you're watching for outliers or things that are coming out of a process control, if you want to lean on that sort of context, that's the important thing, and working toward that continuous improvement. And Dave actually rattled off a whole list of things regarding process improvement tactics. Use those. It's not that critical what your target is. The other pitfall of having a target is that they are, well, a number of them, is that they tend to be pretty darn arbitrary. And by having them arbitrarily set and then attaching some consequence to missing it, you're going to just be encouraging gaming of the numbers, and it's ultimately counterproductive. That's my opinion on putting too much emphasis on those targets.
I guess I'd offer to expand just a little bit. I don't like the notion of using targets until a measurement system has some sort of stability or maturity. Usually a target has a consequence to it, right? There's some valuative component of it. If you're trying to do that with a measure that's you have no idea what its trend is or its stability is, you'll be chasing and making decisions on something not because of level of performance, but because the measure may not be measured right or analyzed or correct analytics applied to it. So the notion of any consequence tied to a target on an immature measurement system just means you'll be running around making really bad decisions. I mean, that would be my personal thought on that. But as we all know, that isn't always how it works, right? So we spend a lot of time saying you got to have a target, and now I'm going to have to teach you how to do it. Well, that's fine. You can teach me how to set it, but if you put any sort of consequence on it, you're really setting yourself up for a headache. And I think it's just smarter to understand how measurement works and how systems work, and implement pieces of the system when it's appropriate.
Yeah, I think all of those, both those responses are absolutely spot on. You know, we do have higher ups, you know, in public agencies, and having to respond to those. But at the end of the day, and that's why I was kind of saying, what we have to focus on is really more the softer side of things, the more judgmental elements, such as, you know, looking at the ability to actually deliver a project. You know, does it make sense? So it's not just the scoring that we're using. You have to look at all of these other logistical and strategic factors.
I'd add, just because the terminology is being kicked around a lot, but lagging and leading indicators, they sound great and they're good to pay attention to, but you have to have the analytics to validate that they're leading. Just because they're temporarily ahead of something doesn't necessarily they're a good predictor, right? So what you really need is a system of metrics and a mindset that says, I know what I want to be able to do. Give myself enough time and enough expertise to do this well, and I'll produce a really good system. But don't push it beyond its expectations, or you're going to turn people off to doing what is really a best practice, right? But it'd be something to pay attention to if folks are pushing really hard for things that are just beyond the maturity of the system, or they're asking for answers that you can possibly provide. You know, run charts are great for processes, but that means they've run multiple times, and you have data over time. We're just not that mature yet, at least in terms of the national transportation performance management effort. I think 10 years from now, we'll look back and ask ourselves a whole new set of questions.
Absolutely.
Great. So seeing no more questions, and if nothing is left to see, to ask, I can go ahead and end the webinar. So I really want to thank everyone for attending the webinar and also our wonderful panelists for their presentation, sharing some good information with us today. Like I said, we are recording the webinar, and that's shared with you on NOCO website along with the presentation. So on behalf of National Operations Center of Excellence and our presenters, thank you for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.